In this tutorial, we're going to create a simple chocolate chip cookie. To create this cookie, we're going to be using a CV curve, the surfaces menu, and then revolving polygons. So in order to start this, I'm going to go to one of my orthographic views. I'm going to hold down the space bar, go to Create, CV Curve Tool, Bezier Curve Tool. And here I'm going to draw a quarter view of what the cookie would look like in the side view. Now the bottom is not too important, so I'm not going to drop a number of Bezier points there, but I will put a few more in and start to develop a contour a bit here on the top. I'll hit return, and by introducing our curve against the y-axis, it's going to be easy to revolve this shape and then to close out the center of the top and the bottom. So I'll go to my perspective view. In my perspective view, I'll hold down the space bar. I'll go to surfaces. I'm going to go to the revolve attributes. And the attributes, I'm going to make sure the y-axis is set. I'm going to choose polygons, quad count, and I'm going to bump the count up to 400 right away so I can play with the contour on the top of this cookie to give it a little more organic feel. So there's the beginning of our polygon shape. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on the middle, and more than likely there is an opening in the very center. We're going to close those out. And I'm going to do so by right-clicking and choosing Vertex. Now I'm going to hit 4 on the keyboard because I would like to be able to see through and make sure I'm not merging vertices that I don't want to. So all I want is that little middle ring. I'll closely marquee select, and I'm going to use the Edit Mesh Merge to Center. Now the tool, you can see, looks like an orange circle. You can place it on your dock if you choose by holding down Command Shift, going to Edit Mesh, and clicking on Merge to Center. I'm going to click and merge the center vertices at the top of the cookie shape, and then I'll do the bottom as well. I'll hit G to repeat the previous function. Now we've got the basic shape for our cookie. Next, I'm going to start to model the top a bit and give it a little bit of a more organic contour. And before I do, I'm going to add a few more lines where there seem to be some gaps in here. I'm going to use the Edge Loop tool. I could have gotten the Edge Loop tool by going to Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop tool. I could have added to the dock by holding Command Shift, Mesh Tools, and clicking on Insert Edge Loop. So I'll use the Edge Loop tool to put an edge in here, and I'll put one out here, and I think I'll put a couple more in here, and then maybe right there. And this is going to give me the opportunity now to go to my Move tool, which is W, and go to my vertices. And in my vertice selection, I'll just start to randomly select some of these vertices. And I'm going to hit B on the keyboard. And I'm going to use the soft select. When I hit B, I see a color change radiating out from the selected vertex. I'm going to double click on the Move tool. And I'm going to open up soft select. And I'm just going to increase the soft selection. And as I do, you can see it also affects a wider parameter of vertices surrounding the selected one. So I'm just going to pull it up, and I'll just go around here and intermittently start to edit these. I'm going to come back once I've done that, and you can resume the video as well once you've done this. And we'll move on with the texturing. But one thing I want to make note of before I go and do the rest of this is quite round, and cookies are very rarely this perfectly round, so you may want to go around the perimeter in the top view and start to edit some of those as well. Now, as you're doing this, you may want to hit 3 on the keyboard to see what the contour looks like. Hit 1 again to go back to your editing mode, though, if you continue to edit those vertices. So I'm going to make this a little bit less symmetrical. And I'll do that on the interior as well. And then when I come back, we'll go ahead and we'll texture this. Now that I've roughed in the modeling process for the cookie, I'm going to apply a texture to it and then use planar mapping to generate the UV map that we'll open in Photoshop to develop our texture. I'll select my geometry in the object mode, right click, choose assign new material, Arnold, AI standard surface. I'll go to the texture itself and I'll name it. And I'm going to take off the specular weight on this. So the specular weight, I'm going to zero that out because I don't want the cookie to look shiny and plastic-like. Now I'm going to hold down the space bar and I'm going to go to UV and I'm going to choose planar mapping and I'm going to go to Y. Now I'm not going to be using the default checkerboard pattern because this is primarily a circle shape. So the UV map will be kind of fit to the contour of a circle, which means the checkerboard box shape, if we used it, would be perfectly symmetrical and the shapes would be perfectly square. I'm setting for Y and I'll hit apply. I'll right click, return to object mode, select my geometry, and then I'm going to go to the UV editor. Now the UV editor can be obtained by going to UV and UV editor at the top. Once again, if I held the Command Shift and clicked on it, I could apply it to the shelf. I'll click on my UV editor, and in here I'm going to go to View and I'm going to choose Shaded, and now I can see my UV map. I'll right click inside the UV editor and I'll choose UV shell. I'll select it. I'll hit R on the keyboard. I'm just going to scale in a little bit so I have some edges to work with once I go into Photoshop. Now I'm going to generate the UV map. I'll go back to the geometry, return to the object mode, deselect and select it again. Inside the UV editor now, I'm going to go to Image and I'm going to go to UV Snapshot and I'll browse to my folder and I'll name it, save, and then click on Apply and Close. Next we'll go into Photoshop and we'll start to develop the texture. In Photoshop I've opened up the UV map we generated and I've also picked a texture I want to use for the cookie. So I'm going to take the picture of the cookie and copy and paste it into the UV map. Command A, Command C, Command W, and then Command V. And I'll move it down in layer order so that I can see my UV map on top of it. Now the UV map is kind of faint. Very often I'll lock the transparency and I'll choose a color that might show up a little bit more readily on the texture I might be using. So I think maybe I'll go with the black. And now I'm going to scale this cookie shape closer to the shape of the actual UV map. So I'll probably drop the transparency a bit. I'll hit Command T and then I'll just scale it a little bit to fit inside more closely. Leave yourself some space around the edge of the UV map. Go out beyond it just a little bit so you don't get strange anomalies on the edge of the geometry inside of Maya. Alright, I'll return my opacity to 100%. And I want the cookie that I'm creating to be a little maybe browner on the edges, a little darker. Now, at this point, the texture mapping becomes pretty subjective. So I'm going to put a new layer in, and I'll get my eyedropper tool, and I'll just select a deeper sienna color from my cookie picture. And I'll get my brush. I'll use a soft edge brush. And I'll set it to 100%. I'm just going to go around the perimeter a little bit. And then I'm going to change my blend mode to multiply. And I'll drop the opacity maybe to 50% for now. Now I can interactively go back and forth and preview what I just did in Maya and Photoshop quite quickly, making the changes I want, so there's no reason to feel the need to completely commit to a certain texture map here. So I'm going to return to Maya. I'll select my shape. I'll go to my color node. I'll follow the color node out, going to File, and now I'll click on my texture. And when I hit 6 on the keyboard, I can see my texture on here. Now, another thing I want to do is I want to add a bump map to give this a little bit more of an organic feel. So I'll return to Photoshop. And in Photoshop, I'm going to generate a black and white version of this. I'm going to go to Image Duplicate. And I'm going to make this black and white. So I'll go down to the little black and white cookie inside the layer window, and I'll choose black and white. And I want this to be a little lighter. I'm going to be able to apply this, and when I'm done though, I need to generate a JPEG of it to get a true kind of a read on what's happening there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of what I have here as a merged entity. So I'll hit Command A to select all, Command Shift C to copy merged, and then I'll hit Command V. So now I've got a flattened out version of these layers. I'm going to go down and I'm going to go to Brightness and Contrast. And in Brightness and Contrast, I'll bring up the brightness on it, make it very white. I'll increase the contrast. And I'm doing that so I don't have too much of a texture based on these little varying noise-like elements around the texture of the cookie. Now once I've done that, I'm going to select the cookie layer one more time below the brightness and contrast, and I'm going to convert it to a smart object. I'm now going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm going to blur this a bit. And again, this is very subjective. As you go, you'll be able to fine-tune this to whatever you feel like you want. But I'm blurring that again just to eliminate some of those little very small spots, contrasting noisy spots. So I'm going to leave it roughly at 5. I'll click OK. And I'm going to generate a JPEG for this. So I'll hit Command Shift S. And in my folder, name it Cookie Bump, and I'm going to make sure I save it as a JPEG. I'll hit Save, and now I'm going to jump back into Maya, select the cookie shape, and in the surface I'm going to scroll down to Geometry. I'm going to click on Bump Map, and I'm going to go to File. I'm going to follow the bump value out because it's already assigned a spot for that texture when you see that box with the triangle. I'll go to the yellow folder next to image name. I'll select Cookie Bump and put that on. You can see now that it's added that texture. Now what I will do next is to add a little bit more of a realistic approach to the edges. We're going to create a small chocolate chip that we'll place intermittently around the perimeter, rotating and scaling and having it kind of poke out from the edges so it looks a little bit more believable. I'm going to go to one of my orthographic views, and right above the cookie I'll go to Create, CV Curve Tool, Bezier, and in here I'll kind of create a simple chocolate chip. And there's a tendency perhaps to make them a little too realistic before they actually melt a little, so don't worry about making it perfect. Once I've got the shape, I'll go to Surfaces, and I'm going to go to the Revolve menu again. And I don't need quite as much geometry, so I'm going to reduce this to 200. And I'll hit Apply. Again, my axis was set for Y. I'll center the pivot and delete by type history. Now I'm going to get my Move tool, and I'm going to move it down into the surface of the cookie. I'll drag it maybe towards the edge to get started here. And when I return to my perspective view and hit F on the keyboard, there's the shape I have. Now before I go any further, I'm going to color this, and I'm going to choose as closely as I can one of the colors for the melted chocolate bits we're seeing here. So I'll right click on the chip and choose Assign New Material, and I'll go to Arnold once again, AI Standard Surface, And I think I'm going to just back down on the specular weight a little bit. If you take a look at the chocolate actually on the texture map we've used is a bit shiny. So I'll just reduce that weight down to just a minimal amount. I'll go to the color picker. I'll click on the eyedropper and I'll go out and get that chocolate that I want to use. And that looks pretty good. Alright, so now I've got the chip the way I want. So I'm going to go to my top view. And in my top view, I'm going to scale this down a little bit. And I'll just put it on the perimeter like that. And I'm going to start to duplicate and just go around the edge and put some of these in different spots. Try not to be too symmetrical about this. So I'll hit Command D, and I'll put another one maybe here, Command D, or maybe one there, and maybe one there. Now I'm going to start to move these around a little bit differently. I'll tuck it in, maybe I'll rotate so it's just poking out a little bit. Now remember, they melt, so if you need to scale that so that it looks like perhaps it's not this perfect shape that had gone into the baking of this. Now this seems like once I get into the lighter values where I'd really like this to be, this could be a little darker. So I'll right click and I'll go back to my material attribute. And in my material attribute, I'll just change the values of it a little bit, just darken a little bit more. I could even go darker with that. These are all things you can fine tune as you proceed through the modeling process. I won't spend a lot of time on this. There we go. So all of them have been changed because they all share the same texture map. So once again, I'll just go around the perimeter and just make these a little bit different from placement, scale, position. And that's a general idea. I'm not going to spend a lot of time refining this. That's something you would do as you proceed through the process. Alright, so now all we need to do is add lighting. So I'll go to create light, and I'm going to use the directional light just to show you what this looks like. So we can see roughly what this will look like once it's lit and we look at it through the Arnold Render view. I'm going to direct the light down towards the cookie by holding V on the keyboard and grabbing the target and snapping it down to the geometry. And now I'm going to bump up the intensity 3 or 4. I'll go to Arnold Render view, and click on the red triangle, and you can see now there's our cookie shape. Now what's happened here is Arnold sometimes will stop updating as you're working. So if you change textures or light intensity and you don't see a marked difference when you've done something, close out the Arnold window and reintroduce it, and it will update once again. So it's a little bit of a discord between the Arnold Render window and then changes you make in your viewport inside of Maya. And that's pretty much how you would create your chocolate chip cookie.